I mean, I think that Donald Trump is a lot of things. I don't think he's dumb.
Words matter. Donald Trump could have used any word to describe his opponents and critics, but he chose specifically to say this.
We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs.
That was no accident. He chose to call his opponents vermin, a word with a history of hate. Adolf Hitler used that exact word to describe the Jewish people. In 1939, a cartoon appeared in an Austrian newspaper comparing Jewish refugees as hordes of rats. The Nazis used the same comparison in a 1940 anti-Semitic propaganda film that directly compared rats to Jewish people. Historians say this kind of language has two purposes. First, it dehumanizes people. It is easier to consider policies that would marginalize a group of people when you think of them as animals. Second, the words are meant to inflame people's emotions. Trump's connection with his base, it's rooted in feelings that Trump amplifies when he uses this very specific language. Now, we're familiar with authoritarians in places like Russia and North Korea, but Donald Trump's comments remind us that through the years, Americans have had to fight against it here at home. And a very good friend of mine just wrote an extraordinary book about that. It is called Prequel, and I'm thrilled to have its author, my colleague, the one and only Rachel Maddow, here with us tonight. Rachel, I am so grateful that you're here, but I am more grateful that you wrote this book because we need this education. You write specifically how ordinary Americans had to fight against authoritarians and hate in the 1930s. There's a lot of people who don't know about this. Why don't we know about it, and why do we need to now?
Well, first of all, Steph, thank you so much for having me here to talk about this. I never wanted this book to be quite this topical, but it is sadly getting more topical all the time. I think the reason that the history that I write about in Prequel is not better known is because we look back at the World War II era and we think, you know, Nazis over there, good guys over here, we went over there and defeated them, and that's a very comfortable story. The idea that Hitler regarded Henry Ford as his inspiration, that Hitler had a portrait of Henry Ford on his office wall in Munich because he regarded Henry Ford as an inspiration specifically because of his anti-Semitism. The fact that Henry Ford's anti-Semitic books had gone through their 29th printing in the German language by the time Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany is a very uncomfortable thing about complicating that idea that they were the bad guys and we were the good guys. They got some of their worst ideas from us. And there were a lot of Americans here who wanted an American form of Nazism here. And it is something that has come that we didn't have to import from anywhere. We have this within us as much as any other country does. And therefore, we should learn about what other Americans did to fight it, to keep those people out of power and to keep their designs off our government when they were really going for it in the late 30s and early 40s.
But why do so many of us not know about that, right? I'm going to say it again. Hitler viewed Henry Ford as a hero. The average American does not know that. Why?
I think because, you know, we tend to let really big events in history overshadow everything else that's near them. I ran up against this actually a little bit when I did a podcast and a book about Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's vice president. Totally forgotten figure, even though him having the Justice Department bring a 40-count felony criminal indictment against him is actually a very interesting precedent given what we're going through now with former President Trump. It's just that it happened right before Watergate. And so we look back on that era and it's like we can only remember one thing. Well, looking back at World War II, we remember, you know, so many Americans going overseas to go fight the Axis powers. We sort of don't want to contend with what it meant to fight it here. But it was a really big, influential movement here. I mean, Henry Ford, obviously, but also Charles Lindbergh, consensus national hero. Charles Coughlin, who was the biggest media figure we've ever had in this country. The America First movement was the biggest voluntary political organization of its kind. There were 24 members of Congress who were working with a Nazi agent on a Nazi propaganda campaign. It was really big and really pushy and influential. Which it just feels like remembering the fight against that force now is helpful.
Then let's just look back on Trump's own life. He has been using language to dehumanize people for his entire career. Do you believe now, when we're hearing him use these words, it is on purpose?
Yes. I mean, I think that Donald Trump is a lot of things. I don't think he's dumb. And I think that there's things that he understands, whether it's intuitively or by reading about it or hearing about it, about the way the authoritarian project works, the way an authoritarian leader talks. You don't just bumble into, proposing all of the same things that authoritarians all over the world are proposing. I mean, calling the press the enemy of the people, calling your internal enemies vermin, blaming a secret cabal, the swamp, or whatever it is, as some, hidden elite that's that the real people of the country need protecting for. I mean, every authoritarian everywhere in the world speaks this same language and proposes and promises all of these same things, and he just speaks it fluently. And I believe that it's so consistent, it can't be that he's improvising. He knows what he's doing.
But even if his team say, we're taking it too far, this is just a coincidence, he's got Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller flanking him. It is no coincidence. This is exactly what these guys want.
Yeah. And I think what you said, Steph, in the intro is worth underscoring. There's a reason that they do this. It's not just that it is, shockingly transgressive language that gets people excited. What they're telling you is there are people among us, right? Trump, in that phrase, in that section of that speech that you just played a clip from, talked about the internal enemy being worse than any external enemy we have as a country. Well, if the internal enemy is the dangerous thing, what does that mean you want? It means two things. It means, one, you want Americans to think of themselves as not being among their fellow citizens, where everybody has an equal right to vote and decide on the fate of our country, which is democracy. You want people to think that there's an enemy inside the country from which they need to be protected and that we need to put down in some way. So you need a strong man to do that, and you can't use a democracy to do it. The other thing they want you to do is they want you to think about the need for violence against this evil thing that is so threatening to us. And that's why you talk about that enemy in non-human terms, to try to bring down people's natural inhibitions against violence, so that, people don't think about killing vermin, killing some sort of pestilence as some sort of immoral thing. They think it is something you do to protect yourself and your family. And when you talk about your political opponents at home as people who deserve that kind of treatment, you're trying to justify the worst against them.
So the American fight against fascism, juxtapose that against what Trump is doing. You have studied this topic extensively, and you cover the current news. Are you scared, Rachel?
I sort of feel like we don't have time to be scared, Steph. I feel like there's a lot to do. I mean, it's hard to be a 250-year-old democracy. It's hard to be a democracy. I mean, there's always people who are pushing against it. And right now, the most powerful force in conservative politics is pushing really, really hard against it. And part of the way they want us to get there is some variant of a civil war. We don't have time to worry about it if that's going to preclude us from working against it. And time is short and the river rises. Now's the time, if you're worried about it, to get involved.
Rachel, in a perfect world, a book about fighting fascism shouldn't be on people's Christmas list. But this year, I think we need it to be.